Hello, everyone. I'm here with a special guest today. Armand, do you want to introduce yourself? I guess I'll introduce you first, since I
Five.
can brag a little bit on your behalf, and then we'll have you introduce yourself. So, Armand debates for Plano West High School, was second at NSDA Nationals last year, won TFA states in Texas, has accumulated a total of 22 bids across a few years of debate, and is currently on Team USA for World Schools, does a lot of PF as well. Is there anything I'm missing? Do you want to introduce some things about yourself?
Maybe less about debate. I have a
Sure.
dog, he's almost 5. I love coffee. Had a lot of coffee today. And I like this topic. I didn't debate the January topic, but it didn't seem too interesting, and this one seems a lot more interesting to me. And pretty even between the sides. So that's always a good topic. That's like interesting, good topic ground, and like even between the two.
Yeah, that's awesome. I tend to agree. I think this topic seems like it's going to be interesting. Full disclosure, I know nothing about the ICC except I learned like a few things in some random IR classes in college. I haven't prepped the topic at all though. So that's why I have Armand with me here because he is has done a little bit more work on the topic than I have, a little bit more thinking. So I have some questions for you to get started, and then we'll take the conversation from there. So first, um, let's just for me, I want to make sure I understand this topic. So what is the ICC?
So the ICC is like an international court of mediation. They refer themselves, and like scholars refer to themselves as like the court of last resort if two countries can't figure it out between themselves just by like more informal arbitration, like delegates meet up, et cetera, and try to talk it out. If that doesn't work, you take your complaint to the ICC. The ICC does something about it. The ICC can also like issue its own degrees without being asked to by people. They might say, X leader has committed a crime. They have like a couple of different crimes that they govern. You can sort of call them like crimes against humanity. So you have like, war crimes. There's like rules of war, like don't take POWs, don't attack women and children. There's like genocide. That's a big one. There's like attacking a country unprovoked, like think, Russia, Ukraine. So either you can go to the ICC and they issue a warrant, or the ICC kind of looks at the situation. They're like, okay, maybe somebody didn't come to us, but this looks like something that we should issue a warrant on. In terms of like physical capacity, they're not some like standing army or like, like roving attack squadron that goes out and dispatches troops, but they are good for like making legal decisions and sort of informing like broad consensus for the world.
Right. So I guess the ICC seems like it's a big part of like international law on like the justice side of prosecuting individuals. And as far
Yeah.
as I'm aware, the ICC is about like individual people, right? Like we're not taking cases against countries.
Correct. So if they were to like they might think that, oh, like X country is bad, but they would issue a warrant against a certain person. So in terms of what they've currently issued, that would look like they're condemning Russia, but realistically, it's a warrant against Putin. They're condemning Israel, but realistically, it's a warrant against Netanyahu. Never entire peoples, though. Maybe if it's a country, they might issue warrants against multiple people. Like it's like Israel plus like I don't know, their general, their secretary of this or that. So it could be multiple people, but like never we're condemning the entire government of Israel. They have more power against like certain people the same way like you leverage like individual sanctions, like targeted ones, not just like broad blanket ones.
Right. That makes sense. So what's this whole business about the Rome Statute? What is
So the way I've explained this is like unlike Article 5, which is just like one of many articles of NATO, NATO also has like other things in the charter. The Rome Statute is the ICC, the ICC is the Rome Statute. You can't sign on to one without signing on to other. There's no like I abide by the Rome Statute, but not provisions XYZ 123 of the ICC. If you're on the Rome Statute, you're agreeing to the ICC. So the Rome Statute is essentially please follow the rules and the wills of the ICC. If the ICC has something they want you to do, which is, apprehend a criminal that they issue an arrest warrant for, they want you to do it. So specifically, right, that doesn't mean that the US is responsible for going after and personally capturing Netanyahu. There's like two types of crimes slash criminals that you're responsible for. Either it's committed by a national of your country. So if I take the US, it can be a US national committing a crime within US territory, or a US national committing a crime internationally. The second type is if somebody of any nationality commits a crime within your borders. So any crime within your borders, and then a crime by a national of your country within anybody's borders, the ICC will say, make your best effort. Obviously, it doesn't say like, if you don't, here's a punishment, though they kind of expect countries to like try, but
Right.
obviously like, crime isn't that simple, right? Like you can't just weed out every human trafficking group in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So sort of like a it goes without saying, like make your best effort, which will become important as to why they're not always the most effective.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I guess a few important things there then. One is a question. Does that mean if you join the Rome Statute, can you disagree with ICC decisions? Or like you're mandated to agree with what they say, right?
So you are mandated, but obviously, like the way mandates work is countries can disagree. It's just that they do have something they can leverage against you. So the ICC will say, like, please comply. But if you don't, by the Rome Statute, they give themselves the jurisdiction or they give themselves like the legal authority to sort of investigate you by
Mhm.
themselves. So let's say the US were to accede. There's a human trafficker in the US who's committing crimes. The US is like, I'm too lazy, don't got the resources, don't want to do this. Well, now the ICC does have the capacity to send its own officials into the US, and assuming the US doesn't go like haywire, all like isolationist, you got to let them in your borders, you got to let them
Right.
do your stuff. There's like some states like domestic law, like you can't just go absolutely crazy, but in most cases, international law should supersede.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess I feel like this brings out one of the interesting things about this topic, which is like the difference between discussions about ICC in the real world and discussions about ICC with regard to like fiat and debate. Like
Yeah.
it seems like the realistic case is that if the US like acceded to the Rome Statute, or joined the ICC more broadly and cooperated with the ICC in general, probably this would not look like full compliance with everything. Like even though we are technically mandated to comply, but maybe there's something to be said for like maybe accede to in the context of the resolution does mandate that we comply with all of the things that are bound up in a session. So like in the context of the debate, maybe it does mean that we agree with everything about ICC jurisdiction being higher. But even in the context of the real world, we might not actually do all of that. Um,
Yeah, it might not be realistic, but for the sake of debate, fairness, and the AF having somewhat equal ground, I'm like a big proponent of AF teams making some sort of durable fiat push,
mhm.
just that like when we pass the resolution, it's not like we pass it, but then the US just ignores it because that's like
Right.
stupid, right? Otherwise, why would we debate it? It's the hypothetical merits of fully following it. Like the resolution is not an ought statement the way you might have an LD, but like we assume compliance. Otherwise, it's like what's the point of being AF, right? It's
Yeah,
just
that
a
makes sense. So
yeah.
I guess that means that even in the extreme cases where like IRL, the US probably wouldn't comply, in this resolution, we probably would. And
Yeah.
this is interesting because it creates like a weird gap between literature assumptions and what we actually have going on with the arguments. Because the literature is going to assume that in these extreme cases, like the compliance does not actually happen, even if you are acceded to the Rome Statute. And then the third thing that I think is interesting about like this definition stuff about the Rome Statute is nowhere in this. I've been listening for this. Nowhere in this does it say if you accede to the Rome Statute, you like support the ICC, or like the other ICC activities, right? So I feel like when I'm hearing people talk about this topic, a lot of the arguments are like granting more legitimacy to the ICC, or maybe even material support for the ICC, and something about the ICC being good in other contexts when it like does things in other countries and stuff like that. But it's notable, right? There's no like fiated link. There's nothing inherent to the resolution that says when the US accedes to the Rome Statute, it suddenly like cooperates more with the ICC on other things.
Yeah, because like let's be real. Trump wavers a little on Ukraine. He's still giving them aid, but he's making it contingent on REMS. So I won't say he's 100% for or not for Putin, but like let's take a very obvious example like Israel. ICC, very anti-Israel. They issued an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. Trump is not going to join the ICC and be like, shoot, guys, like, forget the campaign promises. That didn't mean anything. I'm now anti-Israel. Republicans in Congress who are by a wide majority, and like even some Democrats, it's like more than I thought in my like research on like politics arguments, are also pro-Israel. they're not going to change their stance to be anti-Netanyahu, and I think there's a good reason why like the topic committee might not have given the AFs too much fiat power because yes, there's a question of debate fairness, but you can't let debate fairness too much supersede like realness because a
Yeah.
lot of the literature, you're right, is like the US will join, but they will kind of screw it up a little.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like a good way to put it maybe is like the interesting thing about this topic is it's totally unrealistic that it would happen, like a lot of topics. And
Yeah.
so when authors are writing about it, they're usually writing about it in the context of a lot of other things that would have to change for us to make the decision to accede to the ICC. But, that's not
Yep.
what we have to work with in fiat. Like we're just talking about an exogenous change. Like if everything in the world stayed exactly the same except this one thing, not all of the things that go along with making it likely, just the one thing at the end. And so I feel like that does open the door for some weird sort of things happening in this topic. One example, to add on to what you were saying about Israel, another example is actually about Russia. Because it seems like the current US interpretation of international law with regard to the ICC is this weird, like, uh, this immunity doctrine idea that parties that are not party to the ICC, like countries like Israel or the US or Russia, that currently are not signatories and not acceding to the Rome Statute at all. The US interpretation right now says if they're not a party to the ICC, you shouldn't violate their sovereignty, so the ICC should not have anything to do with them, basically.
Yeah.
And this I've read like an article that says this sort of gets in the way of U.S. efforts in international law against Russia, since Russia is not acceded to the ICC. So U.S. can't really support the ICC going after Russia when it sticks by this immunity doctrine. But I don't know that the immunity doctrine would change if we acceded to the Rome Statute. Like maybe there are other reasons why we have this interpretation of international law, and even if we accede, those other reasons might not go away. So a lot of authors are writing about acceding to the Rome Statute as if this also completely changes our interpretation of international law. But it's more like the other way around, right? Like the authors are talking about changing our interpretation of international law in order to get us to accede to the Rome Statute, not that acceding to the Rome Statute in and of itself would change our interpretation of international law. So there's like some weird things going on with the literature here.
I think there are a lot of issues conceptually with fiat. Like fiat also ignores the fact that US domestic law does not really support the idea of having jurisprudence or like jurisdiction over crimes against humanity, war crimes, that type of stuff. There's like a wide body of literature that says that the US, per things like its own domestic law or the Vienna Convention, would not be able to comply with the ICC. But I don't think this will okay. I don't think this should come up in more technical rounds where fiat is something that we don't understand. I don't like this is like more of like an argument thing. I don't think that, in lay rounds, teams should shy away from making arguments that would screw with fiat because like your knee jerk is like, oh, I have fiat to say this. Like that's not real, right?
True.
Fiat is like it's like a fake concept. I do think it's worth it to say like even if it doesn't mean the AF can't happen, it'd probably be very difficult or very annoying international law and even domestic law wise for the AF to happen. So I think that's one of the reasons why I like this topic. Like it forces you to get away from the like strange implementation debates that
Yeah.
sometimes would occur on things like thing that comes to mind is the HSR topic from
Right.
like yeah. Yeah.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, I'll move on to some more concrete questions about arguments. The first question that I have is like, what do you think the core of the topic will be?
Um, I think okay, I think what a side like what a team should approach as the core of the topic depends on what side they are. I am of a possibly unpopular opinion that neg teams should write their arguments with the idea in mind that you can sort of comp the fact or like you can agree to the fact that the ICC is probably like a little useless and still win your arguments. Or the converse, I think AF teams should also be able to agree that the ICC is a little useless and still win their arguments. It's a lot easier for the neg to do that than the AF, which is why, like, personally, Harvard Prep been struggling a little bit on the AF strats. But I think that while like a lot of debates will center around, is the ICC an effective organization? They have the capacity to enforce things. I think the reality is that they don't, and you will put yourself ahead strategically significantly by designing arguments that are not 100% right or die on ICC effective or not. Because like teams, rebuttal strats, that block file just has like 30 reasons why the ICC just sucks. But
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
take away like if you take away number one rebuttal strat, all the instinctive responses, like teams flounder a little. Like obviously they can go to like their little A2 section, read A2 to whatever your argument is, but they're not expecting an argument that's like, we'll agree as an AF team, ICC probably sucks. Even if the US joins it, probably still sucks. Here's why our argument's still true. I think if you can find those arguments, I think you're ahead of the curve on this topic.
That makes sense. Yeah. Seems like a good foresight for sure. So then maybe this will also make it easier to tease out more of the core of the topic. I want to ask you the generic question, like what do you think are going to be the most stock arguments on the AF and the neg?
So I think the most stock AF arguments, I think one will be an argument you sort of touched on earlier, like the immunity interp idea that right now the US not being in the ICC, it's damaging its credibility. So it's not just an argument that says that the ICC is at baseline, US brings it to above baseline. It's like the ICC is below baseline because of the US.
Mhm.
Which means that it like does more. Like if you think about it like some hypothetical math to the US joining. I also think there are arguments to be made about right now the fact that the ICC does not really have a great power behind it. Like, okay, no hate to like France, Germany, and Canada, but that's like the peak of the ICC right now. No US, China, Israel, Russia, India, damn near any global power you can name is not in the ICC. US probably gives them some credibility. A lot of teams on the AS seem to be reading some sort of funding argument. The US pumps more money into the ICC, which is good because like the ICC is not broke, but they don't have the most money. To be honest though, I think what I've thought of for the app so far, or what the stock seems to be, is like a little weak, and I'm sure we can get to that later. What do I think is stock on the neg?
Real
I
quick
think
on the AF, real quick on the
yeah,
AF. You said that a lot of teams are probably going to read a funding argument. I want to talk about this though, because like
yeah.
I'm not convinced that there's like a link that is given between the resolution and funding the ICC, right? Like maybe there are warrants as to why the resolution will lead to the funding of the ICC, but I wonder what your take is on that. Like, do you think it's like this is like a sort of a granted thing, like 100% of teams will agree on this, or do you think this is actually going to be trouble that people run into?
Like I don't think it's guaranteed at all. I think you're 100% right. Like real talk, we have had bills in Congress over sanctioning the ICC. Trump is threatening to use executive order, like he
Oh,
is
right,
for
right.
things to sanction the ICC. Okay, I don't think it's fair to say that the US gets into the ICC and still sanctions them, but
Right.
it probably proves that fiat can't make the US like the ICC.
Mhm.
And if the US gets in and they're like, shoot, like, I guess if you insist per your debate fiat that we're in here, that doesn't mean that they want to give it money or that they care about ensuring its effectiveness. In fact, I think that's probably true. If the US gets tired of the ICC making it go handle every crime that one of its nationals commits in another country, they're definitely not going to give it more money to make more rulings to make it
Right.
address more crimes. Also, like, even if the US gave it money, like a couple million, I don't, how much
Yeah,
does
yeah,
it
that's facts. Yeah, I definitely think that there's like a good amount of doubt that could be shed on that link. Okay, sorry. Go on, Neg.
The neg. So I think like the like very logical argument on the neg is that the US will screw up the ICC. I don't think this amounts to collapse. I think that's a bit, it's a bit like exaggeratory to say the ICC collapses.
Mhm.
But I do think it's fair to say that the US tries to shift the ICC sort of like strong arm it, bully what are like respectfully like mostly weaker countries in the ICC. There's no big power it's competing with. Like the US competes with, China, Russia, for those of you debating like the UNSC topic as part of the P5. In the case of the ICC, it can like sort of strong arm countries into wanting to follow what the US says. This looks like possibly the US forcing them to go back on their rulings against Netanyahu, which would severely damage ICC credibility. even though they haven't done much against Netanyahu, the fact that they made the ruling was like a pretty big deal in the international community. It was something that was building up a long time. It was in the news. It was celebrated, even if it was celebrated as like a baby step. Going back on that would be pretty detrimental. Honestly, I think other arguments from my like mining of the LD wiki, because like they have a similar topic to us, I think a lot of the other core arguments will be shaped by the LD wiki. One of the popular neg arguments is like an Israel lash out DA that right now Netanyahu is dependent on the US to continue to support the regime because we're one of the few countries that do so, but the US joining means that they have to comply with arrest warrants, which cause Israeli lash out. Um, I think also just for like a lack of creativity, I think a lot of teams will just revert to poll cap arguments, like political capital. I understand why though, because like this idea of the US hating the ICC in terms of like the sanction bills that have been in Congress is like a very popular thing that's coming up. It seems to be reasonably true in the news that US politicians by and large are not biggest fans of the ICC. Other neg arguments. A really this is like the last one. A really stupid argument I see going around is a constitutionality argument. Like like I get it. It isn't constitutional, but like you should just lose to durable fiat. Like,
Okay, wait. I have three things to say real quick. First
yeah.
of all, this is a hot take. I think constitutionality could be a very interesting argument in PF. I know this is a hot take. I know you're going to disagree with me, but it's not for the reason that you think. Like people used to read constitutionality as like a weird sort of trick where they would use it to violate durable fiat, like you're saying. Like I remember I had a practice round against a team from Dalton, and this was on like this was when I was like a first year out for a camp, and it was a demo round, and we were doing Medicare for all, and one of their arguments was like, the courts will like the Supreme Court will rule against Medicare for all, and then later they used it to say that would mean that Medicare for all will go away. So, like all of the AF impacts are not like long term, but all of the neg ones like last. So they used it as like this weird tricky weighing, which is interesting, but that's not, I think, the real reason that constitutionality is an interesting argument. I think there's something to like there's like a constitutive obligation that the United States has to follow its constitution, that people are not reading in PF. But it's sort of a fill argument, but it's this idea that the United States is defined by its constitution in some way, right? The government is defined by the sort of the undergirding document that gives it the power and the jurisdiction to make decisions in the first place. So like the government is not legitimate in making a decision like passing a bill or doing this debate resolution if it does not follow like the code that defines what it ought do. Um, Even if it like all of the other moral systems that might be bound by are sort of like up-layered by this because this is like it's just definitional to what the government is. It's like encoded into the government. It's a very out there argument. I don't think that people will run it, but I just wanted to comment on it because I think it's interesting.
Okay. I'm gonna be honest, like the link story on that, and like the link story on the way people are reading constitutionality arguments is compelling. Like you are correct, it makes sense. I just don't know where it leaves AF ground. Okay, like debate, it's more than just like fairness. I think people get a little too whiny about fairness sometimes. But if the neg is just like the AF is not constitutional, can't follow it, then like what is I don't know what AF ground is supposed to be. Like you're
Wait.
correct. It's just
I feel like the solution to that is one, just say, okay, well, you should have talked to the people who wrote the resolution. Two, like skill issue, just explain to us why constitutionality is not important. And then we'll just have
okay.
the weighing debate. You know, just because we have an
Okay.
argument that's true on our side doesn't mean it's unfair.
I can't talk to him. I can't put a Colin Kapoor in the middle around.
But you
I mean,
get my
like,
point,
no, no,
yeah?
like I can agree that constitutionality is true. Like, if I were to hit the argument, I'd say it probably is. Just read a bunch of fairness first warrants. Just kind of
Interesting. Okay.
side.
Interesting. It's something to think about. Okay, the other things that I
Yes.
have to say, I wanted to talk about this poll cap argument because I am actually a little bit confused about it. So, as I understand, most political capital arguments are one of three things, maybe we'll say, or four things. Like one is generically, it requires political capital. usually from one party to do this. And like the party that would normally want this against the party that doesn't. And so that party would have to expend a lot of political capital that they would, like, power convincing people to grant them this that they would otherwise use on more
Yeah,
important things. So other bills maybe don't get passed. A second version is that if you like, it's not necessarily that it drains the amount of power that you have to pass things. It's more like it requires concessions in the process of normal means. And so other things
sure.
get agreed to. A third version of this is like sort of the same thing, but it's like the writer's argument, right? Like things get written into the bill that support the agenda that is on the other side that you disagree with. And the fourth is like an election scenario, which is not really poll cap, but it's like related, right? Like your chances of getting elected the next cycle go down, and so the power that you
Yeah,
have over the government in the long term goes down. The problem with this is
sure.
it seems like all four of these are rather partisan links. Like Party A wants the policy, Party B doesn't. Party B has other bad agendas, and this is where you get the impact. But I don't know, like, is this a partisan issue for the ICC?
So intuition would say no. I personally think yes. So if you were to just take a cursory look at the news, you would see the reason that the sanctioning ICC bill forwarded by the GOP did not make it out of Congress or the Senate, whichever one comes second. It passed the first one, failed in the second one, is because the Democrats filibustered it. Now, a cursory reading of like the title of the article, you would think, shoot, well, seems like the Democrats don't support the sanctions. Um, no, actually, wait. I'm gonna reverse my. I think the answer might be it's partisan in both worlds. It's a little strange. So, okay, you would think that the Democrats are like wavering because they filibustered it, but if you read into why they filibustered the sanctions, the GOP wanted to pass the sanctions because they wanted to cement their place as being pro-Israel. They're upset that ICC and its officials are issuing arrest warrants against Netanyahu. And apparently, Democrats have come out and said that the reason that they did not feel comfortable voting no to not sanction the ICC is because they did not want to waver on their stance of also being anti-Israel. Because like yes, your average Democrat is more likely to be pro-Palestine, but there are always exceptions to the rule, and honestly, a decent coalition of Democrats who are pro-Israel. So my like conclusion to that like kind of word soup is like I am not totally sure. You never know what like explanations of a vote on a bill, like what's the real truth underlying it. I
Right.
do think that for the sake of arguments, I might read that the Democrats probably are pro ICC and the Republicans are anti.
Right. At least relative to each other. At least relative to each other. That makes sense.
Yeah,
Okay, so then normal means probably looks like the Democrats proposing this, the Republicans saying no, the Democrats saying we'll give you some concessions or we will convince you that this is something that you should pass. And this
sure,
damages political capital for Democrats in particular. Okay, that's interesting.
sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that. And then the last thing I wanted to ask is you noted some of the interesting disads that people are reading on the neg and LD. What are the apps? Like what ICC apps are people reading in LD?
So real funny. The LD topic is it's like a very policy-esque resolution. It's like an and or. You get to pick ICC or unclose. Okay, teams will read T shells that say defend both. But let's forget that, right? When
Right.
teams get an option, they read a purely unclosed AF because the LD consensus is that the ICC AF kind of sucks. Obviously, right, there are exceptions. The ICC AFs I've seen. So I've seen a reasonably interesting kind of soft left AF. I wouldn't call it like a K AF straight up. It's more of like a substantive contention on the ICC, like the US joining the ICC. Theoretically, they would support the arrest warrants against Netanyahu, except the US would actually give the ICC the resources to act on it.
What?
Allegedly, what I know, crazy. I said interesting and not good. I
Right,
think
right,
the
right.
interesting part is the framing part of it, like the
Uh-huh.
reason why like intervening in ethnic conflicts or like healing ethnic tensions is a good thing. Otherwise, the other apps I've seen, are either A, like some sort of war crimes act, either it's hold the US responsible for stuff they do, or the US holds other countries responsible,
Yeah.
or it's the very first thing I mentioned, the immunity interp, that the
Mhm.
US right now leaves the ICC lacking credibility because double standards, the US doesn't comply with like a pretty core part of the ICC, which is like, regardless of whether you're party, if your people like do something bad, we have the right to go and issue arrest warrants, stuff like that. But the AF is not very diverse, which is the only reason why I found it probably pretty untrue soft left Palestine AF to be interesting just because it's different. There's not much on the AF from the
That makes
LDYP.
sense. That makes sense.
Diversity
Sorry,
on the end.
for like the viewers also, the reason I said what for the Israel scenario is because we were talking earlier, like acceding to the Rome Statute does not mean that you fund the ICC. You have to explain why that would lead to funding of the ICC. But more importantly, like it doesn't mean that you change your stance on anything else. Like you agree with the jurisdiction of the ICC. That doesn't mean that you like have to support all of the decisions actively. You only have to support the decisions actively of the ones that are you're obligated to, which is your own nationals or the people who are foreign nationals in your territory, neither of which applies to Netanyahu, right? So there's certainly no fiated reason why the resolution means that we go after Netanyahu. And it's very difficult from there to think of like a warrant why it would cause us to go after Netanyahu, especially given how much that's just so unrealistic, I feel. So without fiat, I just don't think it's ever going to happen.
Yeah, so like the funny conclusion of that like soft left AF is like from talking to the LDers at Planet West, the way the AF gets deployed in the back half is rather than trying to win like contention offense, they will just go for the framing argument almost
Right.
as
Okay.
contention,
Yeah.
just like debates over ethnic conflicts are good, our scholarship is good, it's a reason for us to win.
Bro.
Or they just read a 1AR shell and go for that. But that's.
Yeah.
So not like maybe they could win the contention level offense, but their strat is to not even try, which is probably
Right.
pretty indicative as to the truth argument. Like to be clear, that's not an indict on like the framing level truth, just the substance level truth. I
Yeah.
don't think US would change its stance on Netanyahu. That would look bad for Trump, would look bad for the GOP, would look bad for some Democrats, go against what the US does, which is usually try to strong arm big like supranational organizations. I don't think it's true at all, but
Right. That makes
interesting.
sense. So, okay, in that case, I guess what we should talk about then is how can we make some good app strategies?
Yeah.
Uh, so it seems like one of the biggest problems with the app is what you were mentioning earlier, which is like everyone and their mom is going to have 30 reasons the ICC doesn't work. Which means, and the problem, I guess, more specifically, is that it seems like maybe a lot of these reasons are inherent to the ICC rather than circumstantial to like the fact that the ICC doesn't have enough resources, which
Yeah.
hypothetically maybe could be supplied by the US.
Yeah.
The best AFs, I think, that want to go for like an ICC gets better argument would have to do one of two things. You would have to either one, explain why all of those reasons, in some way or another, that the ICC doesn't work, are connected back to the US not being a part of it, right? Like if you can explain away all of them by just saying the root cause or like at least approximate cause for all of these failings is the lack of the US or even the US, being actively antagonistic against the ICC, which does probably go away if you accede to the Rome Statute, then I think you can solve like almost all of the defense. And just use it as uniqueness instead, right? Like you're right, the ICC is trash right now. That is exactly why we need to fix it by having the US go in um,
Yeah.
I don't know, resources with power with legitimacy, which seems like low-hanging fruit, but also a little bit vague. And the second thing that the AF could do, probably,
Yeah.
if you want to go for like an ICC good argument or ICC gets better argument, is more intangibles. So I guess this is stuff like the US reforms the ICC in some way, even if it doesn't give it more power, it gives it more, it changes it in some way to make it do better things. That maybe things that it is more likely to succeed at, or the same things that it's doing right now, but like in better ways. So it changes the form of it rather than the power, if that makes sense. Like a
Yeah.
reform of the systems within the ICC rather than like a quantitative increase in like legitimacy or funding or something like that. Um,
Sure.
I think these are two interesting avenues because I do think like I think the like the obvious way to debate this topic is to say on the app the ICC is good and we should, or the ICC has the potential to be good and we should make it better. I think you're onto something by saying like it is strategically smart and interesting for the app to admit that the ICC is never going to be good and then go for something else. It's just difficult to say what that other thing is, right? Um,
Yeah, that is the issue I found. It is wonderful to theorize. It would be strategically excellent. Finding the arguments to do that is kind of rough, and the LD Wiki is certainly not helping.
Okay, well, let's
Um,
do better than the LT Wiki. I think one that's interesting, we've played around with this idea a little bit, is like the US accountability stuff, right? And this is a double-edged sword because this is also a neg argument. The link story is, right? The neg is going to say stuff about like violations of sovereignty and stuff. Like if we have to listen to the ICC and they say there's an arrest warrant out for like one of your former presidents, then we have to like what? Do we like by fiat we have to go assist in the arrest of a former president and like jail them under international law? That seems like a massive violation of sovereignty. It would certainly like this is where the neg is going to get, like US hedge scenario links that say like our legitimacy is going to crumble because other countries see that we're like bowing to the wishes of this like international organization that's issuing arrest warrants like left and right for our presidents. But on the other hand, like I do think there's a real AF argument that feels like it has something.
all right,
The,
what us up?
the US has done terrible things, terrible, awful,
Yes,
really, really bad, definitely war crimes, and it just has never
objectively
been held accountable. Um,
correct.
and there's something, it seems important, like I philosophically from a justice standpoint, to hold us accountable. And also from a consequentialist standpoint, maybe this deters like even like the threat of accountability in the future. Maybe it means that we're less likely to do things that are terrible, like war crimes. At the very least, maybe we're less we're like, we are more careful about getting involved in escalating conflicts to the extent that they could produce war crimes that we could then be held accountable for, which might be a good thing. Again, there's a neg argument on the flip side of this as well.
Yeah.
Like if our military has to walk on eggshells and like, uh, but I feel like I'm more convinced by the app here, right? Like,
Yeah. One argument I think it's like a little overhyped on the neg that I think is like quite frankly pretty bad are these like military readiness arguments that
yeah, yeah.
soldiers are afraid of X, Y, and Z. Let's be real. The ICC does not have the time to go after every US soldier. We are everywhere and we commit every crime in the book. Maybe we commit 5% less by your arrest warrants. They really don't have the time.
But also,
Um,
like, even if they did, this is what gets me. I feel like the logic of this argument is so strange. Like, what you're saying is we should not give any accountability for war crimes because if our soldiers are worried about committing war crimes, then they won't do as well in war. Like, what? Like, this is
feels
like
like a K-Link. Yeah.
right. Like this is like saying we shouldn't go after police for police brutality because we need them to be maximally effective and ready to pull the trigger whenever possible. That's what makes them good police. Like no, right? Like that's what makes them brutal. Yeah, I think
Extinction outweighs regulatory.
right, always, always.
Yeah.
So I think there's something there for the AF. I think accountability done right could be a very compelling argument. Um,
Yeah. I think there's like a pretty solid soft left AF, which actually can win the substantive level to be had in PF. This is like a separate thing. Like I think like framing debate is like a dying art for some reason. People like look down on framing debate. Like it's like simple. It's like nice. You can read like a nice little soft left AF. You have some maybe pre-fiat stuff to go for, but you actually do probably have to win your contention level offense. I think it's
right,
good debate.
100%. I think Phil is the next frontier of framing debate. But
You know, like a lot of people hate it, but like I'm gonna be honest, debate Phil is the reason why I like want to do Phil on some level in college. Like post like this little introduction of okay, well Kant's been in PF in like sporadic instances for a couple years. Introduction of Hegel sometime this year has been pretty interesting to me. There's been some Baudrillard here and there over the years. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff. only issue is I think like most PFers, including some of the ones reading it, don't know what they're
Right,
talking about.
right, right, right,
Like
right.
they just bastardize the
Yeah.
literature to say because obviously like you're reading it in a debate context, right? You're gonna blitz through a couple cards when people read their Kant reps arguments. You're gonna say, no, it's not a defense of Kant. Like we've reapplied it to be not racist, guys. Like even though
Okay,
Kant said the N word, yeah,
this is my hot take on fill and debate, and then we'll go back to ICC. I
yeah,
think the best kind of fill and PF would be uncarded entirely. Like
yeah,
literally,
yeah.
literally just like just just the warrants and not any authors, not any crazy esoteric like papers that you have to parse through. Because I feel like more than anything else, cards in fill debate in PF are used as a crutch and an
Yep.
excuse for not actually explaining the argument. Um,
Yep.
okay, ICC.
Yeah. Yeah.
Back to it. So yes, okay. Um, two more things I want to talk about at least before the end of this. One, I think, as far as I'm aware, I haven't seen a lot of people discussing this, but I think there are some good arguments that suggest that the ICC as an institution is net bad. And
Yeah.
therefore, like supporting it is also bad. I know, like one thing flying around is like, oh, maybe the ICC is colonialist. I know that there's critiques of the ICC that like focuses too much on Africa, for example. I think that there's more like consequentialist arguments as well. There's two in particular that come to mind that I learned about in like my human rights class at college. One is that the ICC warrants might actually strengthen the power of the people that they're against. So, for example, the textbook example is Uhuru Kenyatta, who's the president of Kenya, who there's like an article you could find online, but there's anecdotal evidence that suggests that when he got an ICC arrest warrant issued against him, he like spun a narrative that helped him win the election. He was like, the West is out to get me. I'm like the good guys, they're the bad guys. And more people supported him. So his like, this might have actually been the difference between him losing or winning the election, which wound up getting him, the spot as president. So that
Yeah.
seems like it might be pretty bad. Um,
I better not.
we shouldn't support that more. And arguably, this effect could be even magnified further if the US joins because it mixes anti-Western sentiment with anti-US sentiment as well. So it's
Yeah.
the same sort of logic behind the arguments against war on terror that say like this increases terrorist recruitment. It's just like more ICC warrants means people can point at the US as the big bad evildoer who's out to get you, and actually use that ironically as evidence that they're less guilty for the
Yeah.
people that they're trying to convince. A second argument that's consequentialist for like ICC bad is this was a weirder one. I'm not 100% sure where I stand on it yet, but it's an interesting argument that says a lot of these people who are committing war crimes and stuff, they are in wars mostly, right? That's where you commit war crime.
Would
Um,
expect. Yeah. Yep.
and there's sometimes like moments in wars where it makes strategic sense to make like a ceasefire and agree to concessions against people who are committing war crimes, to
Sure.
end war, right? To like reduce civilian casualties. And the argument is the ICC's blind pursuit of justice might actually get in the way of that. Like if there's someone who is weighing whether or not they want to stop fighting, and agree to terms of the other side, and then the international community issues an arrest warrant that says like, if there's peace, we're gonna
Yeah.
step in and jail you for life. Like then you're kind of locked into war. You're like locked into doing even more war crimes, because the punishment is already like maximally high. There's
Yeah.
no potential for amnesty. There's no potential for you to like stop fighting and then live a normal life. Um, and so this is another interesting argument is this might like lock in evildoers doing even more evil, like even more violence. Um,
Yeah. It seems to create a point of no return. Like
right.
this actually oddly probably an example of the ICC being a little better, but post issuing an arrest warrant against Netanyahu, like he tried to do the same thing that the Kenyan guy did. He like got on the international stage. He's like, the ICC is a mess, it's a Western organization, it doesn't know what it's talking about. And like people low-key laughed at him, but he did get more aggressive. So your wins and losses, the losses are probably worse than the wins. But
Right,
I
right.
do think that you're correct that like maybe not 100% causal to the ICC, but at least correlated that Israel is probably forced to get further aggressive. Like you can't just lay down your weapons and kind of kumbaya anymore because you will get locked up for life. So
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, let me know if you have questions for me as well, or other things you want to just talk about. The last thing that I had is I feel like you're right that it seems like a point of pain for the AF that they have to sort of admit in a lot of circumstances that the ICC hasn't really done very much. Um,
yeah,
I want to introduce some different ways of thinking about the ICC that maybe challenge that assumption. I think that there's sort of three. This is like IR class 101 stuff. There's like three ways we can think about the ICC, right? There's like the realist conception, there's the liberal conception, and there's the constructivist conception. The realist one is what most people in PF subscribe to, which is like sort of implicitly, which is like the ICC doesn't really do anything because it doesn't really have power. It doesn't like no one cares about the ICC because they're just like they just laugh at the ICC. Like, what are you gonna do? What I care about is people who have power to hurt me. And ICC doesn't have power to hurt me, so I have no incentive to follow it. Um,
sure.
the second conception is the liberal conception, which maybe has more of an explanation for why the ICC hypothetically could be effective. The liberal conception says, like, well, it's not only about power, right? It's not only about like the amount of money that you have and the amount of guns that you have and things like that. It's also about politics. And the ICC issuing an arrest warrant in international politics, this sends a very strong signal from the international community that this is something that you should not do, right? The fact of the arrest warrant shows that all of the people who support the ICC um, are against this action in a very strong way that otherwise might be difficult to coordinate. And this is the liberal idea of like why institutions like the UN actually do anything. It's because
Yeah.
it's a way to coordinate like norms and arrangements from
Yeah.
all of these different countries that sends strong signals to other countries in the international community. And these signals themselves, they might be indicative of things like the relations that you might have with other countries if you choose to do something that was prosecuted by the ICC, right? So without the ICC's existence or with a reduced ICC, you have less of this signal, and it is harder for countries maybe to like know that other countries will be super against them, or like they don't really fall in line as much to signal to other individuals how much they will lose in terms of relations from doing this kind of action. In terms of
Yeah.
domestic politics, it's a little bit similar. Domestic politics is fuzzier because you get the cases like in Kenya where it might actually strengthen the leader. But in lots of cases, like having an arrest warrant against you, it probably sways domestic politics against you a little bit as well. There's a stigma that's created against you. The third one is the most interesting though, because I'm not super convinced by the realist or liberal cases for the
Yeah.
ICC here. I think the constructivist one is really interesting. So constructivism is not, it's kind of like its own thing that could be applied with realism or liberalism, but it sometimes gets treated as a third thing. So it says there's something else entirely that we're not thinking about. It's not material. It's not like the amount of power or the amount of votes that you have or the relations that you have. It's just like culture and social norms. The idea is that there are some things that are actually rational materially for us to do that we don't do because of things like stigma and things like there's like sort of like a taboo against it. There are lots of like I think maybe obvious examples. One example is like we don't do cannibalism, right? Even though technically it might be rational in some circumstances, there's like a most of the reason we don't do it is because you cringe, right? Like it's a cultural taboo that we have. There are other reasons to
Sure.
not as well. There are
Sure.
like there are rational reasons that are material, but a lot
Yeah.
of it is the cultural, right?
Yeah. No, you're
And
right.
the constructivism says the same thing applies to international politics. For example, my professor Nina Tannenwald, she wrote this thing about how this applies to nuclear weapons, like the nuclear taboo. That like a good part of the reason that no one uses nuclear weapons right now is not because it's irrational or mutually assured destruction or something. A lot of it is because there's a taboo. You don't want to be the person who is the first one to use nuclear weapons since World War II. That you don't want to identify that way, right? And so
Yeah.
the idea behind constructivism with regard to the ICC is that maybe one of the ways that the ICC can make a difference is through a a structuring of the norms of the international community. Like it is a way for us to say this is crossing a line, this is not okay, create stigma against it, say that this is a there should be a taboo around this that like creates a structure of the international culture that leans us further away from allowing war crimes to happen. And then people have a higher sort of mental barrier that they have to overcome before they do a war crime, just because of the cultural shift that comes with more and more ICC cases. And this is like the problem is what the heck is like the tipping point? Like how is the ICC the thing that does this? I mean, like a culture is influenced by
Yeah.
many different factors.
And
Um,
the one thing that comes to mind is like things like the ICJ, like the
right,
International Court of Justice,
right.
also do similar things. And honestly, the majority of literature would suggest that ICJ does it better, but obviously they function differently, hence the need to debate this resolution. But like I see what you're talking about.
Yeah, but even if this is not like an ICC is unique in this, it might be the case that the US joining the ICC creates a signal that supports these norms in some kind of
Sure,
context. Um,
sure.
I just think it's interesting to think about different ways that the ICC might actually be effective, even if it is ineffective when we look at case by case examples. Um, it's at least worth exploring, I think. Uh, yeah. So my 2 cents on the topic, I think that there are kind of four main categories of arguments. It's divided between ICC good and ICC bad. And then this helps the ICC or hurts the ICC. And then like any combination of those, right? Like the ICC is a good institution and we help it. The ICC is a good institution, but you hurt it. The ICC is a bad institution and we hurt it, which is good. Or some sort of reform corruption arguments, like you hijack the ICC and prevent it from getting anything done because you like bias the ICC with US involvement, or you support the ICC through like form reforms. I think those
Yeah,
would be like that's the constellation of the stock.
that makes sense. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good telling of the topic to me.
Cool. Do you have anything else you want to talk about?
Honestly,
Any
I think
hot
it's.
takes?
Oh, okay. Any hot takes? Um, I don't. Well, wait, I don't know how hot of a take some of these are because like I haven't talked to a ton of people about the topic. Um, I think the like delay on the ICC will be pretty AF biased. That seems counterintuitive because we've spent like the last like hour kind of saying how sucky the ICC it is and how useless it is. But one of my USA coaches, or actually the Team Canada coach of all people, explained this to me really well. He's like he heard me talking about the topic at breakfast. He kind of just came up and started offering his thoughts. Um, let's take like every issue that ICC can solve ever. Israel, Palestine, Russia, Ukraine, gendered violence in Afghanistan perpetuated by the Taliban. Realistically, none of these things are being solved now. Israel, Palestine, we will likely get through a cycle of ceasefires that will be broken in some way, shape, or form. We will continue sending aid to Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine realistically will not get any closer to winning. Honestly, they are getting a lot closer to losing than they were a couple months ago. Gendered violence will always be an issue under the rule of the Taliban. I feel like it's somewhat persuasive to say that okay, risk of offense is like a technical term. I would never say that in front of somebody's mom or dad, but like let's be real, right? I don't think that the ICC will do anything. But if you can create some doubt as to the ICC totally sucking and being completely awful, then it seems reasonable to say that if I can paint the ICC as an actor with some power and some ability to create change, it's probably a good idea to vote AF. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel that's
No,
reasonable. Though I do think that like the more technical debates will be a little neg biased, which is why I say like net, and I'm thinking more about this from like a Harvard perspective, which I think is actually honestly this year pretty mixed. I think if like the lay is biased towards the AF and the tech is biased towards the neg, then kind of even out.
Okay, here's a hotter take. I think the tech's going to be balanced. And here's why. Here's why. Bear with me. Bear with me.
But
Based on what we've just talked about for what exists on the neg, besides like the weird Israel DA and stuff like that, most of the core of the topic on the neg is also about how the ICC gets worse. So saying the ICC is not good right now just gives up uniqueness. Uh,
correct.
it's like the ICC does not do anything, just suppresses both sides of the topic, most of the stock
Yeah,
argument. It just like sort of is a blanket limiter on the magnitude of all of the arguments, except some random DAs or fluffy legitimacy arguments here or there. Um, like US hedge arguments and stuff like that. But the
yeah,
vast majority of the arguments, if you say the ICC does not do anything ever and will not ever do anything in either world, then you sort of just nuke the entire flow. Um,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I actually think you nuke it asymmetrically. I think that if you say that the ICC does nothing in any world, it is more likely that this harms the neg than the AF, and that is the hot take.
I
The
agree.
reason is uniqueness, right? Because
Yeah,
most like you cannot give a reason on the neg why the ICC is bad right now that you solve because you're the status quo. But you
yeah,
can solve some of those reasons on the AF by saying at least we have a risk of changing it.
correct.
And so I do think this is asymmetrical. And so I think if this is the main strategy that people use, I think the AF in tech rounds actually using risk of offense has a pretty strong advantage.
Yeah, yeah.
Like at least
Um,
there's risk of solvency.
I think something neg teams need to realize, and I don't think they've realized it all from the few wiki docs I've looked at, which, to be fair, only two bit tournaments of the topic so far. More to come this weekend. Stanford's a big one. I know like Bel Air is a big one for Texas, maybe not outside of Texas. Neg teams don't seem to get that if the ICC sucks, like, okay, I'll take an example. There's like a drones diss out in the topic that the US would not be able to commit drone strikes if they join the ICC because they do kill innocent civilians, even if they're targeted at terrorists. We really don't care who our drone strikes hit. Well, if the ICC is useless, then the US just skirts it, or somebody else just skirts it. You can kind of find a way to do it. You can be like, I thought it was just terrorists in the village, guys. Like I promise I didn't know there were women and children there. You're Israel this ad. If Israel and the US, like if Israel truly depends on the US and they're like somewhat buddy buddy, they're not gonna look at the ICC as a condemnation of their relationship and be like, you joined this useless, spare parts organization and this means you hate me, I'm gonna lash out now. Okay, I wouldn't say all. A lot of neg arguments that are like the ICC forces the US to do something bad. You cannot lose the fact that the ICC sucks. Otherwise, it will not force the US to do
Right.
something bad. You, as the neg, would probably agree the US does not care about complying with the ICC, right? Like, it's why you're negating. Obviously, you're not going to read the US ignores everything, but they just would ignore everything. Like, I don't think it's messing with durable fiat to say, like, loopholes do exist. You're not directly contradicting the ICC. You're just like, you're finding a little workaround.
Right. And
I don't
an
know.
example of that is like fiat does require that you comply with ICC decisions, but if
Yes.
US joins, it might manipulate the decisions before they happen, right? Like
Correct.
you recognize the jurisdiction of the ICC, but if you just change the ICC, then it doesn't matter if you recognize their jurisdiction. Um,
Yeah.
okay, last hot take related to all of this that I have is I think the arguments about reforming the ICC, like changing the ICC on the AF, or on the neg, like hijacking the ICC, like corrupting the ICC. I think that's going to be a more consequential frontier of clash than the arguments about increasing or decreasing the power of the ICC. I think that the AF mostly will run arguments about funding the ICC and granting it more legitimacy. I think those are not as important as the arguments about changing the way the ICC operates. For example, I think the reform arguments are exactly what you're saying can escape all of the neg disads, right? Like any argument that the neg has about why the ICC does something bad, the AF just says, okay, well, if the US recognizes that is bad, the US just uses its new power within the ICC, uses that leverage to change the ICC is that it doesn't pursue that thing. This gets into the weeds, right? Because this gets into the neg arguments about hijacking the ICC as well. But I think that is where like more consequences will happen for actual changes to the ICC, especially given that funding the ICC is not a given, and the neg doesn't have a lot of arguments about fracturing the ICC either.
Mac, conclusion of this is that I think I have an abstract that I
Let's
wanted to talk
go. Okay, I'm
after
glad.
we're done. I think I've come up with something. I think it'll be fun too. It'll be a little different than what we
Okay,
agreed.
okay.
Um,
Sounds good.
and actually, like I actually think I might agree with your hot take. Like, I don't think the neg. Okay, the neg has a lot of argument diversity in that. Yes, they're mostly all dependent on the ICC being effective to force the USA's being bad, but there are like a bajillion different scenarios. There's like six different pull cap scenarios you can read, especially in the context of Trump. You can get like five links into hedge. You can get an Israel scenario. There's like Africa scenarios, etc., etc. But what you don't have is a diverse thesis. Your thesis is the ICC forced the USD swing bad, and that thesis will mean that this is a topic where, for teams that are heavily reliant on cutting cards and spreading those cards, good generics will win you rounds. Good generic cards say the ICC sucks will win you rounds. I won't say don't have to do argument specific prep like write case next because that's just like I'm not trying to encourage that, but like you don't. The F has more like fewer arguments, but every single one of those arguments is a different thesis.
Yeah.
I think just in terms of forcing teams to think a little and use their brains, next teams are going to be like, shoot, I got a cakewalk. I'm going to pull out these three arguments you've never heard of before. It'll be some random political capital bill that nobody's ever heard of. Some random country lashes out, and then
Yeah.
whatever third contention they want to throw in. And
Yeah.
then if the AF team is just like even this much smarter, the neg would just get, cooked. I don't
Yeah,
know.
100%. 100%. Okay. It's been great talking with you. You've given me some things to think about. So thank you
Thank
so
you
much
for
for
having me.
this topic analysis, Arman, and I'll see you later.
All right, peace.